Thank you. Okay, it's just after 12, and the hearing session is resumed. Slightly delayed because of some technical difficulties, but welcome back. Okay, so I just want to just a little request. If anyone is to speak, if you could just move close to the microphone, that will help those who are with us virtually. I just want to move on to questions 10 of our questions, and that's the Thames Water Bygrove Road. And just to the council, can you briefly summarise why you consider exceptional circumstances do not exist to justify that removal of the mole designation from that site? Is that Miss O'Donnell or Miss Butler?
Miss O'Donnell.
Thank you, Miss Butler. So as set out in the council's response to question 10, Thames Water put forward, obviously, in their Regulation 19 submission to the council that they believe their site at Bygrove Road should be entirely removed from the Wandle Valley Metropolitan Open Land. Subsequently to that, we had some conversations and a specific meeting with Thames Water to discuss this issue among some of the other matters that they raised. That was in October 2021. At that meeting, we were able to receive further information from Thames Water about what the site is currently used for, what the future plans may be, and they were able to explain to us in more detail why they propose to remove the site from Metropolitan Open Land. So all the information is combined in our statement, so I'm not going to repeat everything, just to touch on a few of the points that the council thinks are of the most importance. The site itself is clearly open. While there are some small built form and some structures on the site, it's not of the council's view that it is not clearly distinguishable from the surrounding area as per London Plan Policy G3 B1. It's also important to note that the Green Infrastructure Study, which is document 15D1, the consultants who undertook the Green Infrastructure Study for this portion of the Metropolitan Open Land, they actually proposed to increase the Metropolitan Open Land on this site to cover more of the Bygrove Road site. Upon review and having further discussions with Thames Water, the council didn't feel that this was appropriate. However, we do feel that the current mole boundary is justified. We feel that it's clear it has been situated in the Wandle Valley corridor for a number of years. We do not feel that the points brought forward by Thames Water in terms of their future plans and the potential changes from an operational site to a non-operational site, which are not currently they're not currently cemented. There's been no decisions made on that from Thames Water. We don't feel that that justifies exceptional circumstances to remove this portion of the Wandle Valley from Metropolitan Open Land.
Thank you, Mr. O'Donnell. Just a few things following on from that. Obviously, we weren't at that meeting. There are no known intentions for Thames Water for the site. That's correct, isn't it? But then they state that it's operationally very active. Can you, for the hearing, shed any light on the significance of non-removal for Thames Water from an operational point of view? Did they mention any of that at the meeting that you had back in October 2021?
I'm just checking my notes here. I do believe that they do a review of all London-wide Thames Water operational sites every 5 years. So the discussions that we had with them were more looking forward rather than current intentions. So that's why we've put in our statement that there are no current clear intentions, that they know what is going to happen on the site. The discussions that they brought forward through the Regulation 19 response and at that meeting were more of the flavour of, if we decided in 5 years' time we wanted to do something, the removal of mole of this site would allow us to do that more easily. that was the discussion. I mean, I don't want to put words in their mouths because obviously Thames Water is not at the hearings at the moment. Yeah, it was more upon reflection, the fact that the operational, it's a very, very active operational site, and they were able to give us a lot more detail on what is on the site at the moment. And for example, there is a borehole that allows them to drill water if there was ever a drought in London. So things like that are not currently used, but are there on the site and would enable it to be used in future. The council doesn't believe that the mole on the site hinders any of that operational usage in any way.
So are you aware of any activities they've done, and not in terms of changes of use of the site, but any activity that they've carried out recently that's needed planning permission? And you know, what has mole sort of been a significant impediment to that?
I don't believe so. I'm not aware of any planning permissions recently for the site. I'm not sure if Miss Butler is aware of any.
No, we're not aware of any planning permissions that have discussed mole in any detail.
And just following on from that then, I was going to ask a question on what you say to the concern that they're having to demonstrate VSC as part of any application that would add delays. We heard a little bit of this earlier in the discussion. You know, for example, would they have PD right, permitted development rights as a statutory undertaker anyway? You know, what would they achieve? I didn't know whether the council wanted to say anything on that, but I think you've probably already answered that question just. But you don't, I think, just to sum up what you were just saying then, is that you don't think that there's any effects from keeping this as mole operationally or in terms of delays to delivering any statutory functions.
That's correct. And I've just searched Merton's Planning Explorer to note that planning permissions were granted for portable staff welfare units and temporary use of the sewage pumping land for ancillary office in 2016 and 2018. And certainly these weren't brought up in the discussions we've had. And it's not something that's been raised as an issue with restricting the operation of that land successfully.
Yeah, obviously we've got their statement on it, and we've heard what you've said on it in terms of the evidence base that supports a plan, and noting that the plan will be subject to review as well in 5 years. So things, you know, if things do move on from Thames Water's point of view, that might be an opportunity to look at it again at that point. Ms. Roberts, you wanted to come in?
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to make a contextual point, which is that in a meeting with Thames Water in relation to a site in Enfield, which is Greenbelt, that they had done something similar with a local plan review there in terms of putting it forward for removal of the designation on the basis that they may need it in the future. And I obviously at the time I just was surprised, I suppose, because I felt that was not the way that things worked and that it was inappropriate. So I'm quite interested to see that something similar has happened here, and I just thought that you should know about that. That's all.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Roberts. I think there's also the Thames Water evidence suggests that their analysis says it doesn't contribute very strongly to mole, but obviously the council is of a different view in this respect. But obviously there's that wider perspective that Thames Water may want to keep their options open, and that's why they're promoting mole, and we're fully aware, mole removal, sorry, and yeah, we're fully aware of that point. So is there anything further on this from the council's perspective at this stage?
Nothing
There
to
is,
add.
sorry, there's probably one final minor point I'd just like to mop up. Thames Water in their representation make quite a bit of reference to a Beckton site, the largest sewage treatment works. Is that in the borough? Did you want to make any comment on? I know Beckton's not in
No.
Merton, but whether it was referred to by another name.
No, I think it's fair to say that the Bygrove Road site, while clearly very active, seems to be that a lot of the operations are below ground. And it's not, there are buildings above ground, but the significance of the height of the buildings or the operations, it seems to be mainly below ground. It's not as easily to see it as it might be in much bigger works.
So it's not comparable, the two sites, in any way.
I haven't visited Beckton, but it's Bygrove Road, it certainly is not a big sewage works.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Roberts.
I do know Beckton. It's the biggest sewage works in Europe. It's huge, and it's in London Borough of Newham, I think. So it's in it would be in no way comparable, I feel. But I'm not exactly sure what they're proposing there. But I have been aware for some time that they were looking for the removal of the designation there too. So the context of sites, water management sites around London being Metropolitan Open Land is obviously also important.
Okay, so just move on then to the next question, and that's in relation to site allocation CW5. And for the council, please, just a couple of strands to this first. Could you explain, please, Ms. O'Donnell, in further detail, the approach that the site allocation provides the opportunity for future development to provide enhanced access to the Wandle Valley MOL through design-led public accessibility improvements? And then second to that, are any changes required given the Environment Agency representation? They make a specific comment that the policy is updated to include the need to enhance the Pickle Stream corridor as part of the redevelopment, to remove concrete banks and restore ecology to the watercourse and the 10-metre wide riverside buffer strip. So the final part of that is, can you set out what the proposed mods are intended to resolve, and obviously impacts a designated open space? So is that sufficient recognition in the plan? Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll take the second part of your question first, if that's okay. I do believe that the council has proposed some modifications to the green and blue infrastructure policies in relation to the Environment Agency response. I will need a few seconds just to pull out what those are, but I will come back to you on that. In relation to site allocation CW5, it is quite a large site allocation, as you'll see on page 101 of the plan, document 0D1. A very small portion of the site, which runs along the western boundary, is Metropolitan Open Land, and that forms part of it's a very small tributary called Pickle Ditch, which forms part of the wider Wandle Valley Metropolitan Open Land. So the site itself is proposed for a suitable mix of town centre uses, but obviously taking into account the open space element and the Metropolitan Open Land element on the western boundary. Any future development coming forward would be expected in line with our policies set out in chapter 15 of the plan to improve accessibility to, and this has a couple of strands, to both the Metropolitan Open Land and also to the wider Wandle Valley Regional Park. So this kind of touches on both of those elements. I'm just checking whether I think we may have proposed a modification as set out on page 20 of our response to matter 5. Main modification 3.4. The site allocation already identifies that part of the site is designated open space. However, on review, the council thought that it wasn't clear enough which elements or which parts of the site were Metropolitan Open Land. So we've kind of cleared up that wording there, making it very clear that it's the western edge and not just parts of the site to the south. On reflection, I'm not sure whether we need to potentially show this element on the site allocation map. That's maybe something we can take away, because that would help the reader understand where that element was of Metropolitan Open Land.
Thanks. We're just making a note of that, Ms. O'Donnell. I think that would be useful if that's annotated on the illustrative map that accompanies the allocation. Might add some clarity there. I think the main modification itself, in terms of the wording, is helpful as well. But that would sort of amplify, you know, and give a good spatial. A spatial focus for that part of the policy, really, if it was annotated on the map.
Okay, that concludes our questioning on Mole. So finally, just before we wrap up, is everyone satisfied that they have said what they wanted to in relation to this matter at this stage? Mr. Thomas.
Thanks. I'll caveat this by saying I went to the bathroom briefly, so I might have missed this point being discussed. And it was on question 5 about the need for compensatory improvements and the modification that the council have suggested in relation to WI3. I know that there's a hearing next week on that matter. Is it better for that to be rolled over into that hearing, or should we, or can I comment on that today?
I think just although we did pose the question generally in this matter, I think it might be better to discuss it at that next session, because there are far more participants expected at that one. So it's in the interests of sort of openness and having a discussion on it, it's probably going to be more useful to park it for them. But we'll make a note of that. Yeah,
just because we had a couple of comments on the modification and our views on it, so we'll pick those up next week.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Thomas.
I'm not sure who came first, but I'll just take Ms. Roberts first virtually, and I'll come back to you, Mr. Coombe.
Hi, I really just wanted to ask about next Thursday, so I don't know if we're at that point, and I could just ask about how, because it's really, obviously we have the MOL hearing today and the WI3 next week, but it seems kind of really odd to have a situation where we have a plan with a policy on MOL on the one hand, WI3 on the other. So it's really just to kind of give us a bit of a steer about how that can be approached, I suppose.
Yeah, well, it's what we've framed in our MIQs on that site, Ms. Roberts. So the MOL is one consideration on that site. There's a lot of other designations that also are important and are reflected in that wider site. So it's if you reflect on our MIQs and look at those, that's what we'll be basing the questions on. Particularly for WI3. Matter 14. For matter 14.
Mr. Coombe.
Thank you very much. I've nothing very substantial to add. We made the point that the evidence base for the changes to MOL status has been a little obscure, and I was looking at the council's reply to question 2B, 5.20. By way of example, it says, with reference to the Green Infrastructure Study document 15D1, the summary of MOL changes document 18D3 and Appendix 1, the exceptional circumstances have been set out for relevant sites. Appendix 1 to the council's reply to the questions from the inspector doesn't set out any exceptional circumstances, doesn't set out any circumstances at all. So I'm completely lost as to where the exceptional circumstances could be found. And perhaps through you, inspectors, we might ask.
Well, I'll ask the council to respond in the first instance, Mr. Coombe.
Can I take this one, Ms.
Sorry,
Butler?
I didn't mean you, Sir O'Donnell.
Sorry. So in response, just looking at Appendix 1 to the council's response to matter 5, it provides some additional information that should aid clarity in each of these sites and what circumstances were considered in the proposed boundary changes. So there's quite a lot of information in column 2, which is about the description of the proposed boundary change, and this just points, it's kind of almost like a summary document to point to the relevant locations or from the other documents. So the council is obviously aware that there are 2 other evidence-based documents for these sites, and they also consider MOL. So this was more just to aid clarity at the hearings if there was going to be specific discussion on any of these specific sites. It also points to any relevant planning applications that the council has looked at in looking at proposed boundary changes for Metropolitan Open Land. We thought that it would be useful not just on a mapping basis in terms of visually, but also in that final column of Appendix 1 to set out the area, so in hectares or square meters of that has increased or decreased as a result of each boundary change. And one of the inspector's questions was specifically targeted at physical features of each of the sites, which stems from the NPPF. So there is further information set out there in column 4 on relevant physical features for each of the MOL sites.
Thank you, Mr. O'Donnell. I will say, Mr. Coombe, I'll let you respond, but there is some overlap between this session and the session that will be happening later next week. I don't know whether maybe you wanted to obviously make your point, but then reflect on what Ms. O'Donnell has said, and then we can maybe pick it up again in that session, because there are inevitably going to be some general points about Metropolitan Open Land and evidence next week as well, and we do appreciate that. You know, there is an overlap between the 2.
Thank you. I won't detain you any further. I would simply observe that Appendix 1 contains data, not circumstances, nor are they exceptional.
Thank you, Mr. Coombe. I mean, we've already flagged up, haven't we, Ms. Butler, that the articulation of that is something that the council's going to look at. So taking into account what Mr. Coombe's views there as well, I think it'd be useful to reflect on that when you come to look at it.
Okay, so unless anyone has anything else to add, that concludes our discussions on matter 5. Thank you very much for all your contributions. The hearing session is now closed.